Okay, so we're with the Reverend Kevin Annett, who is the acting secretary of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Alfred.
There's been quite a public interest in the final proceedings of the International Common Law Court of Justice, and I wondered if you could bring us up to date on those.
Yeah, well, the significance of what's happened today is that we finally posted online the second set of evidence in the first case in our docket, which is the issue of genocide in Canada by church and state. And what's really exciting about this is that it's never been done before in Canada, where an independent judicial body has charged the state, the Crown, the Vatican, with these crimes against humanity, and then detailed them in the setting of a court for actually a group of citizen jurors who are now going to evaluate the evidence and come to some kind of verdict. To give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, if people go to our site itccs.org, January 31st today, that you can see this posting, and some of the evidence in there, I'll just give you an example. We uncovered over the last few months evidence that goes right to the issue of intent to commit genocide. And now this is a big issue. The government and the churches now are saying, well, yes, we acknowledge a lot of children died, but we didn't do it intentionally. It was just because of poor funding or whatever, random abuse, that kind of thing. We found two documents I want to talk about. The first one was a death rate in the Western Indian reservations in the year 1889, which was the year the Indian residential schools opened in Canada. The death rate among the average Indian population was no more than 4 to 5%. In the same year, in the first residential schools that opened, it was 30 to 50%. So those children couldn't have come into the school bearing sicknesses from their culture, because they had the native people on reservation had about the same death rate as white people. But then the children go into the residential schools. They start dying off at a rate of 30 to 50%. The very year the schools open. So that clearly shows that there was an intent to kill these children, or at least expose them to communicable diseases. Because why would the death rate shoot up like that dramatically the very first day, literally, that those kids entered the school? The first year the death rate is as high as it was 50 years later. So that's very significant. And that's the kind of evidence we're showing, along with videotaped testimonies of eyewitnesses, addressing the issue of the plan to create long-term conditions to destroy Native people and the abduction of children from one group to another. In the first posting we did online on November 6th, we looked at the first three definitions of genocide according to the UN Convention. Now we've wrapped that up and made our summary argument. And basically in the summary, we've said that the defendants, which are 32 officers of church and state, this includes Pope Joseph Ratzinger, Queen Elizabeth, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and the heads of the United Anglican and Catholic Churches in Canada. We say these people are guilty of crimes against humanity, and also a criminal conspiracy to conceal those crimes, such as this whitewash that's going on now through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where evidence is suppressed, people aren't allowed to name names, that kind of thing. So in effect, what we're saying is that, according to precedent in other war crimes courts, people have received up to 25 years in prison and had all their property and assets confiscated because of these things. We're simply saying that should happen. And we're looking at the fact that the institutions that did it are still receiving tax exemptions, benefits, legal protection. That isn't allowed under international law. Under the Rome Statute, Section 25, subsection C, there's a section where it says that citizens have an obligation and the right to refrain from paying taxes or being involved in any way in organizations that have committed crimes against humanity. Well, by that criteria, then, Canadian taxpayers are being obligated by the government to support crimes against humanity simply by paying taxes, by subsidizing these churches through tax exemptions, and that's being colluding in a crime. So we're saying, to set things right, those things have to stop. These churches and government, church bodies especially, should be legally disestablished for these crimes they committed for over a century in these residential schools.
Right. So how is this process going to continue now?
Well, we've given the defendants two opportunities already to respond to the charges and to present, as you would in any normal court, giving them the chance to come and present their own case. I mean, they've been accused of planning and conspiring to wipe out, especially in the West, where a lot of the residential schools were targeted, planning to wipe out Native nations in these vast territories. They haven't said anything in their own defense. So that kind of silence would suggest consent, that they're not contesting these allegations, they're not contesting the facts. We're giving them a third chance now. They have 7 days now that we presented our entire case. The prosecution has rested. We've got a 3.5 hour presentation now online with over 150 exhibits that's now posted. They have 7 days to respond, and if they don't, we're going to recommend to our citizen jurors that they then retire to consider the evidence and come with a verdict.
Now you've gone into the genocide convention also, correct?
That's right. We really are basing our court and its actions on two articles, which is, first of all, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and also the United Nations Convention on the Crime of Genocide, which Canada actually ratified in the year 1952 and brought in enabling legislation in the year 2000 in something called the Crimes Against Humanity Act, which allows these laws, international laws, convicting people for genocide to be applied in Canada. So that's kind of the legal basis we're standing on. This is also prompted by the fact that the courts in Canada have time and again said that they don't have the jurisdictional competence to rule on the genocide perpetrated by the Crown, because they're Crown courts. They've abrogated any responsibility for looking at this thing, so we're compelled to go to another level. At the International Criminal Court level, we can't bring charges against institutions, only against individuals. And individuals like Joseph Ratzinger claim diplomatic immunity, so it's a catch-22. We're trying to create a new judicial mechanism to get around that obstacle, which is really serving the perpetrators, and trying to set up a mechanism which will allow not only the full truth to be told and the defendants to have or rather the plaintiffs in this case to have their day in court, but also to find a way of stopping these things, because as we know, these crimes are continuing, especially in terms of child trafficking, rampant child rape and torture in the Catholic Church, which is facilitated by canon law, which orders priests and bishops to cover up child abuse in their parishes. So that whole regime has to change, and this is how we're viewing it. We're seeing this as not just actions against individuals, but against institutions and whole ways of thinking.
What is some of the new evidence? You mentioned that there are over 150 exhibits. What is some of the evidence that came up in these proceedings, and could you talk about some of the 150 exhibits, some of the highlights?
Definitely. Some of it was very dramatic and emotional. It had to do with not just documentation, but people's stories. People describing being sterilized, being subjected to electric shock torture. A number of people talked about that as a way of disciplining children in the schools, taking part in burials, a burial of children who died, regularly. Like I say, the death rate was over 50% often in these so-called schools. But at a documentation level, it also was interesting that nobody has ever talked about this in Canada or at the Truth and Reconciliation gatherings, but apparently the death rate in the Western residential schools was a lot higher than in the East. And this goes to prove the prosecution's argument, which is that most of the residential schools were set up after the Canadian Pacific Railway linked the country, and white settlers had to get out into the western regions quickly. The natives had to be wiped out quickly, and that's why these schools were set up as literal death camps, where conditions were created where they would get sick from tuberculosis and smallpox. They would not be treated at all. Half of them would die. And not only that, some of the evidence we showed, a man described how when he was sick with TB, he was ordered back to go home with the sickness. We found letters from the right up to the 1950s of Catholic priests describing how it was their policy when children were sick with communicable diseases to send them back into their villages. There was also some of the evidence we have is from the parliamentary record, the Hansard, from the parliamentary debates in 1920, when the law was brought in forcing children into these schools. It's amazing. The Arthur Meehan, who was the Minister of the Interior, had just been given that in 1920, he had been given facts showing that the tuberculosis rate among Indians had climbed 3 times because they had abolished medical inspection in all the residential schools, even though the death rate was climbing dramatically. So even though he knew from their own records, they said that tuberculosis has tripled because of the actions of these residential schools, Arthur Meehan stood up in Parliament and said, we are not convinced that tuberculosis among Indians is increasing. So he openly lied in the Commons. We've got lots of material like that showing that the politicians knew, they covered it up. As early as 1891, this Dr. George Orton was saying 40% of the children here are dying because they're being deliberately exposed, the healthy to the sick, as a regular practice. And they knew that, and nothing happened. Year after year, decade after decade. The death rate stayed constant over half a century.
What international bodies, other than the the Tribunal and the International Common Law Court of Justice, has this evidence been formally exposed to?
We have contacts with lawyers in Spain and in Belgium. We also working with 2 lawyers in Germany who have been trying to bring charges against Joseph Ratzinger as a German citizen. These people have all promised that once we present this package of evidence and our verdict of what we think should happen with this, they're willing to take that into the courts of their own countries to judge it for themselves. Now, theoretically, a country like Spain could issue an arrest warrant for any of these defendants. So that's a level on which we want to operate as well. And also, there's a Human Rights Commission in the European Parliament that is looking into the whole issue of the Vatican and their crimes. And we're also seeking that. There's the Inter-American Human Rights Commission in the Western Hemisphere that has the right to look into these things, especially concerning genocide against indigenous people, which this clearly is.
Right. Now, here in Canada, it appears that the government of Canada, specifically the Harper government, has come down sharply against journalists and others who attempt to report this.
Yes.
I know that I've seen various articles criticizing the journalists themselves who report these abuses. Do you have any comment on that?
I've had a lot of experience of that. As far back as 1995, when I was first fired from the United Church for exposing this stuff, the first journalist who came to cover my story was Stephen Hume of the Vancouver Sun, and he was very interested. He actually wrote an article in July 1995 entitled "Minister Who Tried to Bring Indians into His Church Fired," and he went in detail. The next year, I tried to get Stephen Hume to continue this work, and he backed right off. He said he had been told that this was not a popular story, not an issue to get into. I mean, he was quite open about that. That has happened to me more times than I can remember or count. Another example of that is in 2007, the Globe and Mail finally, after 10 years of me putting this information out, the Globe and Mail finally realized they had to comment on it because the government was about to set up their so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So they ran a front page spread on residential schools and admitting that the death rate had been up to 50%. Now, of course, the Ottawa Citizen had reported that in November 1907. So 100 years before, the Canadian press had already been reporting this, but the Globe and Mail acted like this was a big exposure. Bill Curry, their reporter, called me up and he said, I need to meet some people, and who have these stories. I set up meetings with him all over the downtown east side of Vancouver, people who described witnessing killings, engaged in burial of children at schools all over British Columbia. I took him out to the mass grave site behind the Alberni Residential School. When the article finally came out, there was a brief mention of me. The United Church had about 3 or 4 paragraphs in which to comment. The guilty party gets to kind of, have the major coverage in the article. But there was no reference in the article anywhere to any deaths, to the culpability of the church, to any of the stuff that I'd been sharing with him. It was completely sanitized. And when I called up Bill Kerr to ask him about that, he said, oh, well, I guess that was the editor. I said, yeah, but it was completely gutted, the article. There's nothing in there that's new. And you do make reference to the high death rate, but you don't put it into any context. There's no back-up evidence or anything. And he said, well, and he kind of blurted out, well, as a matter of fact, we had another article ready, which was a review of your film, Unrepentant, which, covered a lot of the this evidence on the ground. But we got a call from the Assembly of First Nations, which is a wing of the government. It's the arm, the funded government-funded Native chiefs. And they objected. In effect, it's the Indian Affairs Department that calls up the Globe and Mail editor. And they objected to us running that article, so we didn't. So, I mean, that's an example of the Canadian media. I understand that for any media to get licensed in Canada, they have to have never faced a lawsuit or even a threat of a lawsuit for libel. So when you think about that, if you're in any way controversial and when to look at anything, you won't get licensed in Canada. So the media is already sanitized from day one by that practice. But they understand, especially since 2 families own most of the media here, they understand very clearly that this is an issue to stay away from. And they have. I mean, when we opened the graves at the Mohawk Institute in November 2011, and began to find remains of buttons from school uniforms, things that indicated that, yes, there was probably children buried there. Not one media in Canada reported that historic event, and that finally somebody was investigating and doing forensic research into a clear mass grave of children near a former school. So, I mean, they just completely black out this whole issue. And, it's, in terms of the persecution of reporters, yeah, I don't think there's many journalists left, who have, credibility, who are working in the mainstream. I think a lot of them are, kind of independent.
So now that the International Common Law Court of Justice has come back in this phase, how do you see these? And we're in that 7-day period, I assume.
Yeah.
How do you foresee these next steps happening? Kind of walk us through that process.
Well, as of February 6th, 7 days will have expired. At that point, we've given instructions to all the citizen jurors, quite detailed instructions about their obligation now. We're employing a jury balloting system because we can't gather 58 people from 5 countries into one place. So we're going to ballot them. We're going to have them come to their decision on the basis of knowing what these terms mean. We're giving them a complete education and rundown on the terms crimes against humanity, genocide, criminal conspiracy, all of that stuff, so that they can render a knowledgeable verdict based on what a reasonable person would say. When you look at this evidence, are the defendants guilty of committing crimes against humanity or conspiring to conceal those crimes? When that happens, when the verdict comes in, we've also asked them to come up with a sentence. No, they don't have to follow what the prosecution has recommended, which is 25-year prison sentences and the seizure of the property and assets of these guilty parties and institutions. What is significant, though, and I think the greatest role that people can play is the responsibility they have as individuals under the Rome Statute, which is once you know, and once you brought in a verdict saying, yes, they have committed these crimes, and it's clear from the evidence that they have, then every citizen is obligated to say, okay, I will not collude in this crime by funding these institutions or having anything to do with them. Now, on February 2nd, we're actually launching a new blog radio program called We the Jury, a forum without borders. And that's at 1 p.m. Pacific time, Blog Talk Radio / We the Jury. And the first guest on that show is Andrew Patterson, who lives on Vancouver Island, and he's a small businessman. And he wrote to the Canadian government about a year ago saying, I've read Kevin Annett's website, hiddennolonger.com, and on the basis of that, I need an assurance from the Canadian Revenue Agency that you will not be using my taxpayers' money to cover up or be engaged in genocide or crimes against humanity. Can I please have an answer to that? They didn't answer him. They've just come back threatening him. They put a lien on his bank account. They threatened his customers, all because he asked a question. And in effect, the Canadian government is telling them, yes, you have to break the law, international law. You have to help fund these churches. You have to pay taxes to a government that's committed these crimes. That kind of position is something that more and more people need to take, to say, you know, if there's anything that World War II created, besides 50 million corpses, is the Nuremberg standards. And that says individuals have the right to say no to their own governments. They do not have to collude in crimes against humanity, crimes of murder, genocide. That's what we're saying. So the real power is not in a verdict, but it's in how people enforce that verdict. And that's what we're hoping this thing will, our whole effort will be a springboard to encourage people to do that.
Thank you. Now, how can people support this process and support the International Common Law Court of Justice and really help the process of accountability here?
Well, the first thing, they need to educate themselves into what's happening. So please go to www.itccs.org. The January 30th posting is the latest evidence, which combined with the November 6th posting is a complete body of evidence. And circulate that and be inspired by that to act in your own communities. You know, we stand on a long common law tradition over 1,000 years where people have the right to do what we're doing, to protect their communities when the courts and the government are not. And so encouraging people to take the same steps in their own communities. But also you can support what we're doing directly by contacting me and being part of this whole process. Where over the next year or two, we're going to be starting other cases. The next case after the Canadian situation, we're looking at the connection between the Vatican and big pharmaceutical companies and voluntary drug testing that they've been engaged in for a long time at the behest of the pharmaceutical companies that they have heavy investments in. So that kind of thing, we need people's information on the ground. We need their knowledge of this. So if people would contact me at hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com, you can certainly be part of that process as well.
Well, we want to thank you, Kevin. Are there any thoughts that you'd like to leave our viewing audience with?
I think to really emphasize to people, even though the focus in this first case has been on a history over 100 years of clear genocide in Canada, this is an issue today. Children everywhere in the world are still being trafficked and abused, and 99% of the abusers are getting away with it because they happen to wear a robe and call themselves a Catholic priest. So we are linking up with groups all over the world that are fighting that to disestablish the power of the Vatican and the Catholic Church to do these crimes, to be a law unto themselves. And that requires making the issue a political one and a spiritual one. And that requires a lot of involvement and sustained commitment. This is going to be a fight that expands many years, because the survival of our children and really ourselves and our liberties are at stake in this. So I would just encourage people to realize that's what's at stake, and join us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to have you back as this process goes forward to update us on the progress that you're making.
Thanks, Alfred. I appreciate it.
Certainly.